Okay, good. All right, so let's get started with this. Let's start first with a little overview again of vocal fold morphology. There's an epithelium, but then the lamina propria has a very pliable superficial layer. And then the second layer is called intermediate, and the third is deep. And those latter two are together called the ligament of the vocal fold itself. And then you have the muscle. So you really have 5 layers. These are functionally very important, as well as surgically, of course. Functionally, there's more pliability medially with the superficial layer, and then with more collagen fibers, etc., for the intermediate and deep, they can take on more stiffness characteristics. So the vocal fold is actually built to vibrate, and that's probably the primary reason that we have vocal folds. For those of you who like other evolutionary things, that's too bad. Okay. So we're going to talk about some very, very basic concepts which are very important for a basic understanding of phonation. Let's start first with fundamental frequency. If you're looking down at the larynx, you'll see here the anterior commissure, back of the vocal folds, here the vocal processes that Dr. Sandloff was talking about. What I'd like to now show is if you take a white line like this and then just cut right down, you'll see then this kind of configuration on the left here. During one cycle of phonation, you'll go from the closure here, where the vocal folds are touching, at basically the top there, and then they're slightly opening, they make a maximum opening, and that's called glottal opening phase. And then the vocal folds start to come back toward each other, and eventually they touch, and that's the closing phase. And then you have a closed phase. So you have 3 phases for the glottis motion and the vocal fold motion. If I say about that frequency, that's 100 hertz or so, and that takes about 10 milliseconds. So the relationship between fundamental frequency and the period, you take the period of the one cycle, for example, 100 hertz, in seconds, and then you flip that over and you get 100. So that's the relationship. So let us look at, let's hope this actually works. So this is what the vocal folds look like from above.
And non-vibrating portion.
And they move symmetrically in many individuals like this, with little less flap. Unless it's, whatever. Okay, so here the vocal folds are coming toward each other, and they form this divergent kind of shape because the lower portion is closer than the upper portion. And then they come together, they come together, they come together. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And then when they separate, they form a convergent glottis shape where the distance here is greater than here. And so this oscillation of convergent to divergent is very important relative to vocal fold oscillation, normal oscillation. So let's talk now about the fundamental frequency relative to vocal fold length and contour. As Dr. Sandloff was talking about, you have cricothyroid muscles that move this cricoid up toward the thyroid in order to elongate the vocal folds. But you also have the vocalis muscle here, which when it contracts, it will actually shorten itself because the muscle will shorten a little bit. So you have this antagonistic muscle action between the cricothyroid muscle to lengthen the vocal fold versus the vocalis, which will shorten it just a little bit. Here's the cricothyroid muscle when it is relaxed, and when it's relaxed, it's longer, and the vocal folds are short. When you contract the CT muscle, the green line gets shorter. It pulls the cricoid up toward the thyroid. The vocal folds are attached in front, that doesn't change. But when the cricoid moves up, the cricothyroid joint allows the rotation of the red cricoid here, The retinoid is on top and then pulls back. And that elongates the vocal folds. And if you'd like to see that in action, boy, do we have that in action here. So, let's start here. So, the vocal folds are shorter at low pitches and elongate, and tension actually increases when you, like a rubber band. Let's see the rest of this. How cool is that, right? So, the elongation is really quite important. You'll see that in most studies where vocal folds elongate as the pitch rises. When the pitch is high, like that last, high pitch, the vocal folds are long, but then they also are thin if you look at them from the front. Assume that the volume of the vocal fold is constant, and so if you elongate the volume, it's got to give so that in the middle, along the length of the vocal fold, so the volume is preserved. And that's essentially what's happening. So when you elongate the vocal folds, they become thinner if you look at any vertical area here. And the glottis, the vertical aspect of the glottis also becomes thinner. In the falsetto that you just saw, at the very highest there, it's probably just 1 millimeter or so vibrating of the glottis there. But as you go down to lower pitches like normal, that's always funny to me, and the really low pitches, they're really shorter and thicker, and so they look like this. The thickness is often measured from the tip of that arrow down to the tip of the arrow. So that's kind of a thickness. It also means that the vertical length of the glottis is also increased. You can also create that by contracting the vocalis muscle to bulge this lower portion out. When you see an expression with an equal sign, you should rejoice. On the left here is this funny little F sub O. We call it F sub O, by the way, for oscillation. This has a relationship relative to primary variables, and this is the glory of a good equation that actually is pertinent, which this is. L is actually the length of the vibrating vocal folds, whether they are short or long, like just demonstrated. T is the tension, good tension, physical tension, nice tension, of the vocal fold itself. If you elongate the vocal fold, the tension increases. That's passive intention that increases. If the vocal fold muscle is involved in the motion, if you contract the muscle itself, its active tension increases, so the tension increases. And so this tension aspect is very important, as well as the length. Rho is the density of the tissue, which shouldn't really change too much. So as you saw, as the vocal folds were elongating, the length increasing, the pitch went up, the fundamental frequency went up. This means that the tension increases faster than the length increases when you have that motion. The length might increase 10, 20, 25%, but the tension will increase much, much more. And many of you will know this as the dreaded square root, and even when that's present. What's really cool is when you trade off the tension for another expression, you can get this expression, which is very important clinically to me. The F here is force, like the force that pulls on the vocal fold, like the cricothyroid essentially is doing. And then inside here you got length and mass. Again, you have length underneath and mass underneath. Now what happens if you have edema, you will increase mass, but you won't necessarily increase the length of the motion of the vocal folds or change the force of the cricoid. But if you, double the mass with edema or something like that, the fundamental frequency goes down. Instead of just these two competing against each other, now you have actually this primary. Actually, I had checked this equation against when I was really sick, and instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, a lot of edema. And I looked down at my larynx, and I would say that's about double the mass, and then the equation turned out right. So that's science. That's how voice scientists work. They figure it out, and then they try to prove it. Okay. So we have registers. We have very basic registers. Fry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Chest, more modal, falsetto, and then we have also, you know, head register, mixed registers, and is this playing? Here we go. All right. Here we go. All right. Cry has a fair amount of constriction and medial positioning. And the interretinoids, in this case here, are working pretty hard. So the fry actually is what some people, we don't say in the closet, but it's like in the kitchen or someplace. They'll do fry to exercise the interretinoids. This is chest, it's higher pitch, of course. Beautiful mucosa wave there. I'll sell that to you for $10. It doesn't have as much adduction, but it's really kind of nice. And then we should have the falsetto sometime. Falsetto. This is setto, that's not true. The motion, notice that the motion is really the same mucosa wave. It's just at the upper tip though, because the vocal folds are elongated. And as you know, if you do this right, you can make millions of dollars singing with a group like Temptation. It'd be tempting. That's tempting, actually, that kind of group. Okay, so basic registers, and I don't have any other illustrations, so because this is just basics. All right. So, adduction is another primary variable which one must never forget, especially when dealing with registration. If you're going to go from some sort of middle register to an upper register, and if you want to, you know, sing with beautiful mixed and all that, you better take adduction into consideration. Not just what's the vocalis doing, what's the CP doing, and what's the sublautal pressure. Adduction is critical, so let's talk about it. As Dr. Sadalov was talking about really nicely, on the cricoid cartilage here, you have 2 retinoids. And if you look at the facet connecting the retinoid to the cricoid, there are 2 axes. One is a short axis, the yellow line here. I don't know if you can see that. Oh, no. And also a long axis. They both have the short and the long, but that's fine. Now, the short axis is the rocking axis when the retinoids are going to rock in, so the vocal processes come down and forward. And the long axis is, if you contract the interretinoid muscles in the back here, that pulls the retinoid up and back. And both of those happen at the same time for normal abduction and adduction purposes. So the rocking motion is like a cylinder with something on top that's, you know, like you have a hand in your fist, something like that, synovially. The retinoids, again, on top of the cricoid here, it's got a posterior retinoid ligament. I'm sure you can read that, that's beautiful. And the action here is the retinoid comes down and in, and David Broad kind of measured that as like 30 degrees and all that scientific stuff. And so then there's a gliding motion of, it's like on a cylinder, right? So now you have both the gliding of the retinoid and the rocking, and combined, when you go from an abducted position like this is the vocal process on the right vocal fold. This is the vocal process tip on the left vocal fold, and some tracheal rings, etc. The retinoids are over here, and over here, and the interretinoid muscles in here. Now, when this larynx goes to vibrate like it has done here, it rocks down, so the vocal processes are going to come down and in, but at the same time the retinoids are moving up the facet, and so what happens is the position of the vocal processes look like they just come straight across. So I'm going to illustrate that with all the good lighting here. Watch this. I will put lights on the tip of my fingers, pretend they're there. And so down we come for the rocking, and then up we come with the gliding, and you do that, and the fingertips just come right across. See? Perfect. Got that? Good thing you have brought your video camera. Vocal qualities. If you have maximum opening for maximum inhalation, exchange of gas, air, there is a maximum separation of the vocal folds, and we would measure that between the vocal processes. Now, as you adduct these two vocal folds by movement of the retinoids, by the way, the retinoids are the workers with the muscles attached to them. The vocal folds just go where the retinoids tell them. So, vocal fold adduction is first a retinoid adduction. You will really, if you do that a little bit, you will reach a place where there's a breathy boundary, like that, something that's really breathy. Now the vocal processes gap here, in this example, is 14% of the maximum distance here. And people who are really interested in the health, function, repair of joints need to really understand these kinds of dimensions. Then there is a normal breathy kind of boundary and a pressed normal boundary. And then if you go beyond that, it can be so compressed that you can't phonate no matter what the sublungs pressure is. So the phonatory adductory range is from just breathy phonation, where there is oscillation of vocal folds, to the boundary of pressed to normal. And so that's a phonatory adductory range. You cannot phonate unless the vocal folds are in the phonatory adductory range, placed there by the trustee retinoids. Yeah, let's see if we can see this. Okay.
Voice qualities will now be demonstrated. If I talk in a very breathy manner, such as this, you can notice that the space between the two vocal folds is slightly open toward the top of the slit.
Close to your
This
glottis.
happens, air escapes, and you get the breathy sound. If I press the larynx too firmly together like this, then the structures are pressed together and you get that pressed sound.
Notice that the positioning is medial as well as anterior, posterior, toward anterior, toward the middle. So this is an overall kind of purse string collapse of the situation, and this takes a lot of muscle work. And so at the end of the day, this person will be tired doing that.
And if I talk normally, they are not so pressed together.
Let's talk about subglottal pressure, interglottal pressure, transglottal pressure, vocal fold motion, and glottal airflow. So how do we actually create air pressure for phonation? That's called subglottal pressure, tracheal pressure, lung pressure. It's not really lung pressure. There's a little bit of a drop of the pressure by maybe a half a centimeter water. But let's talk about sublungal pressure. So what do you do typically? You might inhale air, because it's going to be egressive flow here. Set the level of the glottal adduction, say it's going to be breathy, or I want to be normal, I want to be pressed, and apply relaxation pressure that Johan's going to talk about if he ever shows up.
He's here.
Hello, Johan!
Hi!
Bill Coleman. Oh, good. Now I don't have to give your talk. Great. So, there's relaxation from recoil of the system after you inhale, and there are muscle forces that also allow you to reduce the volume of the lung. If you have a lung that the volume is constant, there's no airflow. If you want airflow, you have to reduce the volume of the lung. And you do that by all the things that Johan's going to talk about. Relaxation, pressure, muscles, and all that good stuff. Okay, when will phonation happen? If the vocal folds are close enough and pliable enough, and the forces to reduce the lung volume are high enough, again, you have to have airflow going. This creates enough subglottal air pressure to force the vocal folds to move into oscillation if you've reached the phonatory threshold pressure. So the subglottal pressure rises when the vocal folds are closer to each other or there is greater force to reduce the lung pressure. That is, subglottal pressure rises if you have the adduction set and now you increase the speed at which the lung volume reduces. That's going to shove air more and it's going to increase the pressure that is shoving that air. If you close the vocal folds more, then you have to be careful about wondering how do you increase subglottal pressure. But if you allow the lung volume to change at a constant rate, you'll actually have higher subglottal pressure. So there'll be a quiz on that afterwards. Phonatory threshold pressure is the lowest subglottal pressure that causes phonation. It's measured in humans around 3 for lower pitches, and it rises. This is very individualistic, and we worry about how people actually configure the glottis when they're doing this on humans. But clinically, it's very important. If you have a lesion, usually PTP is high. You fix the larynx, PTP lowers. It's an objective measure, and one also pertinent to training. So I think I just kind of not said that well, so we'll go on. So transglottal pressure is doing phonation. The transglottal pressure is what drives airflow through the glottis. And it is the difference between the pressure in the glottis, that's funny, that's hilarious. I was skipping to the next topic. It's the transglottal pressure is the pressure in the trachea minus the pressure that's just above the glottis. That's transglottal pressure. Subtraction of 2, lower minus the top. Intraglottal pressures, though, are different. They depend on the transglottal pressure, and they depend on the contour of the vocal folds. But they are not the same as transglottal pressure. The interglottal pressures are the pressures that push vocal folds and pull vocal folds so that the person is phonating. Here's another illustration for the cycle. You have the touching here and the flow that's coming through. If it's not 0, it's from the posterior glottis open, which is fine. And then the glottis starts to separate, at which time the glottis has a convergent shape. The flow is coming through, the glottis is convergent, and what are the pressures on the vocal folds to push them out? They are positive when this shape is convergent. And it's positive because the tracheal pressure, subglottal pressure is positive. That communicates and pushes the vocal folds apart. That's what separates the vocal folds. That's Bernoulli equation, but not Bernoulli effect. Bernoulli effect is later because it's defined as negative. This is just merely shoving them apart. And that's what happens. It's very simple. Maximum opening occurs, but that is not when the maximum flow occurs in humans. The maximum airflow out in the cycle of glottal flow occurs when there's a slight divergence. When it's divergent, the vocal folds, the glottis has a divergent shape, and Right. And this is what we say here. This maximum opening of the glottis comes before the maximum flow. And this is the phrase, many of you heard it, skewed to the right. The airflow peak is skewed to the right, that is later than the maximum glottal area. So from looking above, that's what skewing to the right means. It's due to inertness of the air, because the air has, of the vocal tract air, because it has mass, and so that slows down the flow coming through. It's also due to the divergence rather than convergence. If you take a divergent shape with the same diameter and pressure, the divergence actually has more airflow. And then also you have kind of a wall squish when the folds come toward each other, squishes the air. So those things allow the flow to be skewed to the right. During the divergence, the pressure in the glottis is negative, and that's due to Bernoulli, but also to rarefaction above. Thank goodness. And that negative pressure again is due to Bernoulli, the rarefaction. And I want to stress this. It's also potentially due to vortical structures in the glottis during that closing phase, especially when the angle is larger. And this statement is given in honor of Sid Khosla, who passed away recently. Notice now that when the vocal folds are maximally separated, the recoil back is maximum. The air pressures in the glottis are not very high. They're basically zero in normal phonation. But the recoil back starts. So here's what happens. When the folds are kind of close, positive pressures push them. Those pressures decrease. When it reaches its maximum excursion, recoil pulls them back. The air pressures pick up about halfway through there and are maximum to finish the job when the recoil is least. So those are always playing with each other, and it's a nice collaboration. Then you have, reducing the opening here, so the airflow is reducing, and then it comes back to basically what it is when the vocal folds, the membranous vocal folds are closed. You still may have some airflow, but that's from the posterior glottis, and that's very normal. 0 to 67 cubic centimeters per second out of the posterior glottis is normal. I've basically said that. Let's look at airflow. This is so cool, and this is a video from one of Dr. Khosla's guest canine larynxes. So here we have the two vocal folds, and as you, okay, let me go to 513 or so. All right, this is actually what the flow looks like. So what you have here is the vocal folds of right. You can understand that for sure because it's like anybody else. And they have seeded the flow, and then they are illuminating the flow. And so you can actually see these puffs of air. And these puffs of air, they are changing the airflow rate as the vocal folds vibrate. And that is a source of sound in phonation, the changing airflow, volume flow, right above the glottis. And so when you talk about and hear about source of phonation, sound source of phonation, it's this airflow right above the glottis. And this will be fun. So this is a nice computational model of, flow. So if I stop that, here we have pressures that are driving the vocal fold out, and you have these blue airflow lines, and then you have vortical structures later, and this is the kind of work that a number of voice scientists are doing. They're trying to create valid computational models of phonation that asks and solves a lot of our questions about the interaction of all these variables at the same time, as well as applied to clinical, especially surgical, etc., orientations. And you want to see a cough? We'll finish with that. I'm already over a minute and 32 seconds. All right, so if you have a frog in your throat, this is what a cough looks like, courtesy of Heather. So it's a complete compression of the vocal folds. This is high-speed video. The tissue begins to shake, and then and the true folds are down here, so it's there.
Can we see it again so we can record it?
I already have it video.
So when I saw this, I said I'd never cough again. And then Brittany Canine, my student at the time, put the frog in. All right, thanks. That's it.